The letters arrived every week without fail, and every week Duchess Evelina Ashworth carried them to the fire unopened, not one word read, not one seal broken. Just paper, curling black in the grate of her morning room, while the household staff pretended not to notice, and the rumors about the cold marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Marchwood grew fatter with every dinner party in London. She had her reasons. God knew she had her reasons. It began, as these things often do, with the room full of candlelight and a woman's voice pitched just loud enough to carry. Lady Southerton, 3 glasses of claret into the evening, had leaned toward her companion at the Whitfield ball and said, not quietly at all, that the Duke of Marchwood married for the settlement and stayed away for his sanity, and that his wife was woman nobody with sense would choose to keep close. Evelina had been standing near enough to hear every word. She kept her spine straight and her smile pleasant, because that was what 4 years of marriage to a distant silent duke had trained her to do. But something in her chest had cracked that night like ice underfoot, and she had gone home to Marchwood House alone, because he was in the country as he so often was, and she had sat in the dark of her bedroom, turning the humiliation over and over like a stone in her palm. He did not love her. Everyone said so. And the proof was in his absence. Months at the estate while she remained in town, letters that arrived with dutiful regularity, and said nothing of substance, cool inquiries after her health and the weather and whether the roof repairs at the Dower House had been settled. Not once in 4 years had he written a word that could be mistaken for tenderness. So, when the next letter came, she didn't read it. She told herself it was pride. She told herself she would not sit alone in a candlelit room parsing some dry paragraph about drainage ditches for a hidden thread of affection that did not exist. She would not be the fool who read longing into a man discussing sheep. Better to burn it unread than to read it and find, again, that there was nothing there for her to find. It became a ritual. The post came. Pursed and Sidbertian, all. She recognized his hand on the outside of the folded paper, a firm, slanting hand, economical with its flourishes much like the man himself. She would carry it still sealed to the hearth and let it go. The housekeeper, Mrs. Selt Pruitt, a broad, gray-haired woman who had served the Ashworth family for over 20 years, watched this happen more times than she could count and said nothing because it was not her place. But her mouth would tighten just slightly every time the wax seal met the flame, as if she found the sight of it every bit as painful as watching someone starve a healthy plant on a windowsill in full sun. Evelina told herself she did not care what the servants thought. She told herself a great many things that autumn. What she could not tell herself, no matter how she tried, was that she did not miss him, because she did. She missed a man she had almost never truly had, the tall, composed figure who had married her 4 years ago, in a ceremony so correct and so cold that her own mother had cried afterward, not from joy. She missed the idea of Julian Ashworth, Duke of Marchwood, more than she had ever possessed the reality of him, and that was its own particular kind of grief, mourning something that had perhaps never existed at all. He was not cruel to her. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, even in her most bitter hours. He had never raised his voice, never humiliated her, never once behaved with anything but scrupulous, chilly correctness. He simply was not present, not in the ways that mattered. He spent the growing season at Marchwood Park in Derbyshire, walking his fields and meeting with his steward and, for all she knew, speaking more warmly to his horses than he had ever spoken to her. He wrote to her because it was proper. He inquired after her welfare because it was expected. And she had decided, somewhere in the 2nd year of their marriage, that she would rather believe in his indifference outright than keep hoping for a thaw that never came. Burning the letters was, in its own strange way, a mercy she gave herself. The estate in late autumn smelled of wood smoke and wet leaves, of beeswax polish rubbed into old banisters, of roast pheasant drifting up from the kitchens on the evenings when the Duke dined at home, which was not often, even when he was home, because he took his supper in the study more nights than not alone, and, quote, with account books and correspondence stacked at his elbow like a wall he was building around himself. Julian Ashworth had never considered himself a romantic man. He was reliably informed, mostly by his sister, who found endless amusement in the fact that he did not make jokes so much as he occasionally allowed a sentence to be slightly less serious than the one before it. He ran his estate the way his father had taught him, with precision, with patience, and with a deep, abiding conviction that a man's worth was measured by what he built quietly, not by what he announced loudly. This had seemed, for most of his life, a perfectly sound philosophy. It had not served him well in marriage. He had married Evelina Fairfax, as she was then 4 years prior, in a match arranged with all the warmth of a property transaction, because that was, in fact, largely what it had been. Her father needed the alliance. His estate needed her dowry in that particular lean year, when a bad harvest and his own father's dying debts had left Marchwood's coffers thinner than any duke liked to admit. They had met twice before the wedding. She had been quiet both times, watchful, her gray eyes taking in far more than her mouth ever offered up in conversation, and he had thought, with the arrogance of a young man who believed silence and shyness were the same thing, that she would make an unremarkable, uncomplicated wife. He had been wrong about that, as he would come to learn, in nearly every particular. What he had not accounted for, what no one had thought to tell him, least of all himself, was how difficult he would find it to say aloud the things he felt. His father had been a hard man, undemonstrative to the point of frost, and Julian had absorbed that lesson so thoroughly he did not even recognize it as a lesson anymore. It simply felt like the shape of himself. Affection, in his experience, was proven through action, through providing, through attending to duty, through the 1,000 small competencies of running an estate and safeguarding a family's future, and not through pretty words, which he distrusted anyway, having watched more than one charming Doppin, silver-tongued young lord ruin a woman's prospects with exactly that kind of talk. So when he found himself, in the months after his marriage, wanting quite desperately to say something true to his new wife, and finding the words simply would not come, would lodge somewhere behind his teeth and refuse to move, he had done the only thing that felt safe. He wrote it down instead. Not confessions, not at first. He was not so bold nor so foolish as to open with his heart on his sleeve to a woman who barely knew him. He began instead with small things. Brissest. An account of a fox that had gotten into the henhouse and outwitted 3 grown men and a dog for the better part of a week. A description of the first frost silvering the parkland, and how the deer had come down close to the house that morning, bold as anything, as if they too were curious about the new mistress they had heard about but never seen. He wrote about drainage ditches, yes, and about sheep, because those were the true textured details of his days, and he had nothing else honest to offer her but his days. He told himself at first that these letters were simply good manners, a husband keeping his wife informed, since propriety and his own temperament kept them so often apart. But as the months passed and the letters accumulated, something in him had shifted without his quite noticing, the way a man might not notice a room growing warmer until he realizes he has stopped needing his coat. He began writing to her the things he could not say to her face. He began, in the quiet of his study at night, telling her, on paper, safely at a remove that let him be braver than he was in person, that he found himself thinking of her at odd hours, that he had bought a particular shade of blue silk in the village because it reminded him of a gown she had worn once, though he never sent the silk, because sending it felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit even to himself. That he missed absurdly the sound of her reading aloud in the drawing-room on the rare evenings they'd spent together before duty called him back to Derbyshire, a habit of hers he had never once told her he loved. He wrote, and every week he sent what he'd written, and every week her replies came back to him, composed, polite, distant, brief acknowledgments of receipt notes on household matters. Nothing that answered what he had, in his clumsy, buried way, been trying to ask her for years. He told himself this was simply her nature, reserved, cool, a woman who had been raised as he had, to keep her feelings tidy and out of sight. He did not know, could not have imagined, that his letters were burning unread in a Marchwood house grate 200 miles south, and that the composed little replies he treasured, kept, and eventually began to save, folded carefully into a rosewood box in his study desk, had been written by a woman who believed she was writing into a void that would never answer back with anything but obligation. Neither of them knew the shape of the other's silence. That was the tragedy of it, and, though neither could see it yet, also the whole of its cure. The winter that year came early and hard, and it was a matter of business, not sentiment, that finally brought the Duke back to London in December, a meeting with his solicitor regarding a boundary dispute with a neighboring estate. Nothing more romantic than that. He arrived at Marchwood House on a Tuesday evening, with frost still clinging to his greatcoat, and found his wife in the morning room, a shawl around her shoulders, a book open on her lap that she did not appear to be reading. She startled at the sight of him. He noticed that. He noticed, too, how quickly she smoothed the reaction away, how her face resettled into the careful, pleasant neutrality she wore like armor, and something in him, some small, persistent ache he had carried for years without naming, wondered, not for the first time, what exactly lived beneath that composure. "Your Grace," she said. "I did not expect you business," he said. Economical, as he always was. A dispute with Faring over the northern hedgerow. I did not think it wise to settle it by letter. Something flickered across her face at the word letter. He did not catch its meaning. He rarely did with her, a fact that troubled him more than he let show. "You are well?" he asked, because it was the question he always asked, and because he did not know how to ask the ones underneath it. "Quite well," she said. "And you, well enough?" They stood like that for a moment, two people who had shared a name and a house and a bed on the rare nights duty required it, and who, none the less, spoke to each other like distant acquaintances exchanging pleasantries at a funeral. He found himself absurdly wanting to ask her whether she had read his last letter, the one about the frost and the deer, the one where he had come closer than he ever had to writing the word he meant before he had crossed it out and rewritten the sentence twice as dull. But he did not ask. Asking felt like exposing a wound, and he had spent a lifetime learning not to do that. "I will be in the study," he said instead, "should you require anything." "Of course," she said. He left her there, in the low firelight, and did not see the way her hands tightened around the book in her lap the moment his back was turned, nor hear the small, unsteady breath she let out once the door had closed. It was Mrs. Pruitt, who finally broke the silence of the household, not to the Duke directly, which would have been far beyond her place, but to the young footman Thomas, who had the unfortunate luck of asking her, in the servants' hall 2 nights later, why her Grace insisted on burning her letters instead of having them properly disposed of by the maid. "Because," Mrs. Pruitt said, setting down her mending with more force than the fabric strictly required, "she does not wish anyone to see that she has not read them." Thomas, young and not especially discreet, repeated this, in a somewhat garbled form, to the Duke's valet, Higgins, 3 days later, while brushing down a coat in the boot-room. And Higgins, who had served Julian Ashworth for 11 years and had developed, in that time, a loyalty that occasionally overrode his sense of what was and was not his business, mentioned it to his master that same evening, phrased delicately, as one mentions a thing one is fairly certain one should not be mentioning at all. "I'm told, Your Grace," Higgins said, folding a cravat with great concentration, "that her Grace does not open your letters." Julian had been in the middle of removing his coat. He stopped, one arm still in the sleeve. "Explain yourself." "I only know what I've heard below stairs, Your Grace. That her Grace burns them, unread." The room went very quiet. Julian finished removing the coat with the exaggerated care of a man giving his hands something to do while his mind caught up to what had just been said. "You are certain of this? I would not have repeated it otherwise, Your Grace." He dismissed Higgins with a nod that gave away nothing, and then he stood alone in his dressing-room for a long, long moment, feeling something in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for, because he had spent so many years not naming things. Unread, 4 years of letters. 4 years of the only honest words he had ever managed to give her, sent south with a fidelity he had never once broken, through every silence, every distance, every cold, incorrect exchange in every drawing-room, and she had burned them. Unread. He thought of the small rosewood box in his study desk, every reply she had ever sent him, folded and kept, because even her briefest, most guarded notes had felt to him like something worth preserving. Proof, however thin, that she thought of him at all. He had told himself some nights, alone, with a glass of brandy and the fire dying low, that a woman did not keep writing back, year after year, to a man she felt nothing for. He had built a whole private theology out of her replies, reading warmth into her careful phrases, the way a starving man might read a feast into a crust of bread. And she had not read a word he'd sent her. The hurt of it arrived first, sharp and total, and then, more slowly, more dangerously, the anger. He thought he had done everything right. He thought he had been faithful in the only language he knew how to speak. And she had thrown it, unopened, into a fire, 4 years running, and let London believe whatever it wished about the cold Duke and his colder wife, and never once told him. But even as the anger rose in him, something else rose alongside it, quieter and far more painful to look at directly. If she had burned his letters unread, truly unread, not merely dismissed, but never even seen, then she had spent 4 years believing whatever silence had told her to believe. And he understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the worst moments, exactly what that silence must have said. It would have told her he did not care. It would have told her the rumors were true. It would have told her that a man who wrote nothing worth reading was a man who felt nothing worth saying. She had believed she was married to indifference, and he had let her believe it because he had never once found the courage to say out loud in a room, to her face, what he had spent 4 years writing in the safety of paper that never seemed to reach her. He did not confront her that night. He told himself it was because the hour was late, and that was not entirely a lie, but the truer reason was that he did not yet trust his own voice to say what needed saying without either wounding her or, worse, wounding himself past the point of retreat. Instead, he did something he had never done before. In 4 years of marriage, he went to her writing desk, not to pry, or so he told himself, though a small honest voice in the back of his mind noted that this was exactly what he was doing, but because he needed, suddenly and urgently, to know something. He needed to know whether there existed anywhere in that house a single letter of his that she had kept, one, just one out of the hundreds he had sent, that she had read and folded away, rather than fed to the flames. Her writing desk was a small, elegant thing near the window of her private sitting room, and it was, he discovered, entirely bare of correspondence. No drawer of kept letters. No box, no ribbon-tied bundle. Nothing at all resembling the rosewood collection that sat, weighty with 4 years of her replies, in his own study. He searched, carefully, guiltily, telling himself the whole while that he had every right, as her husband, and knowing the whole while that this justification would not have satisfied him had their positions been reversed. There was nothing, not one letter of his had survived. He sat down slowly in the chair at her desk, a chair that smelled faintly of her, lavender water and beeswax and something else he could not name, something that was simply her, and he felt, for the first time and longer than he cared to admit, entirely and completely lost. Evelina found him there 20 minutes later when she came to fetch a book she had left in the sitting room, and the sight of her husband seated at her private desk, still in his shirt sleeves, his cravat loosened, staring at nothing with an expression she had never once seen on his composed face, stopped her cold in the doorway. "Your Grace." He looked up. For a long moment neither of them spoke. "You have never kept a single letter of mine," he said finally. Not an accusation. Precisely. Something closer to grief, spoken aloud. Her heart went very still. She had known, on some level, that this reckoning would come eventually. One did not burn 4 years of correspondence forever without the fact surfacing. But she had not expected it tonight, in this room, with him looking at her like that. "No," she said. "There seemed no point in denying it now. I have not." "Why?" The question hung there, plain and enormous. She thought of Lady Southerton's voice at the Whitfield ball, sharp with claret and cruelty. She thought of every dry, dutiful line she had glimpsed on the outside of his letters before consigning them to the fire. The polite salutation, the correct closing, nothing more, because she had never let herself read further than that. "Because I did not wish to sit alone in a room hoping to find affection in a paragraph about your drainage ditches," he said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake. "I decided some years ago that I would rather believe outright that you felt nothing for me than spend my life searching your letters for proof of a tenderness you were never going to give me. It seemed the safer grief. Burning them unread cost me less than reading them and finding, again and again, that I was right to expect nothing." He absorbed this in silence. She watched something move behind his eyes, something that looked almost like pain, which confused her, because pain was not an emotion she had ever associated with him. "You believed I felt nothing for you," he said slowly. "Everyone believes it, Your Grace. I have simply had the misfortune of being married to the belief. And you never once thought to ask me. You never once gave me reason to think the answer would be worth asking for." He stood then and crossed the room to the small writing desk drawer she had not thought to close, and though there was nothing in it to find, he touched the empty space with 2 fingers, as if he could feel, in the wood grain, the shape of everything that should have been there, and was not. "I kept every letter you ever wrote me," he said. "Every one, since the first month of our marriage. They are my study, in a rosewood box, and I have read each of them more times than I would ever admit aloud, searching them the very same way you say you feared to search mine." Evelina's breath caught somewhere in her throat. "That cannot be true," she said, though, even as she said it, some old buried hopeful part of her wanted desperately for it to be. "Come and see," he said. "I will not ask you to believe me on my word alone. I have given you very little reason, these 4 years, to believe me on my word alone. But I will not ask you to take this on faith when the proof exists and is only 2 rooms away." The study, when they entered it, smelled of leather and cold ash and the particular dust of old books that had not been moved in some time. And Julian crossed directly to the heavy oak desk near the window, opening the bottom drawer with the quiet, deliberate care of a man handling something sacred. The rosewood box within was not large, perhaps the size of a family Bible, but it was full, nearly to overflowing, papers folded and stacked with evident care, some yellowing slightly at the edges, the earliest ones clearly older than the ones near the top. He lifted the lid and stepped back, as if presenting evidence at a trial. And in a way, Evelina understood, that was precisely what this was. She approached slowly. Her hands, when she reached for the topmost letter, trembled slightly, and she was too raw in that moment to bother hiding it. She recognized her own handwriting immediately, the careful, upright script her governess had drilled into her as a girl, a script she had used to write dutiful, guarded little replies for 4 years, never once suspecting anyone would think them worth keeping. "I trust the harvest at Marchwood proceeds well this season," the letter read in her own hand, dated some 14 months prior. "The weather in town has been unseasonably wet. I hope you are keeping well." Nothing. There was nothing in it. No warmth, no feeling, nothing she would have imagined any man treasuring, let alone a duke with a rosewood box full of them. And yet there in the margin in his slanting hand was a small annotation, clearly added after the letter's arrival, clearly written for no eyes but his own. "She thinks of the weather when she thinks of me. Perhaps, some day, she will think of more." Evelina's hand went to her mouth. She reached for another. And another. Each one as guarded, as dutiful, as devoid of anything she had ever consciously intended as affection, and each one annotated. In his hand, with some small private hope, he had folded into her indifferent words like a man finding water in a desert and calling it a feast. She asked after my health this time. Read one margin note beside a letter that had done exactly that. In a single flat sentence, she has never asked before, "I choose to take this as a kindness." She mentions, she read the book I recommended, read another. I do not know if she liked it. I have decided to believe she did. Evelina's eyes filled, and she did not try to stop them. "You built a whole cathedral," she said, her voice breaking on the words, "out of scraps I never meant as anything." "I built," Julian said quietly, "the only thing I had to build with. You gave me scraps because you believed that was all I wanted from you. I took the scraps because I did not know how to ask you for more without risking that you had none to give. I burned yours," she said, "because I believed the same thing about you, that there was nothing there, that reading them would only prove it. Then we have spent 4 years," he said, "each of us protecting ourselves from a rejection the other one never intended to give." She let out something between a laugh and a sob, and pressed her hand flat against the stack of her own letters, feeling, for the first time, the sheer aching weight of everything that had gone unsaid between them, all of it preserved here, in this box, by a man the world believed incapable of feeling anything at all. "Read them," he said. "Not mine to you. Those are ash now. I understand that, and I do not fault you for it, not any more. But read what I wrote in the margins. Read what I have been telling myself, alone, in this room, for 4 years, because I did not have the courage to tell you any of it to your face. She did." She sat in his chair, by his desk, and she read every annotation in that box, one by one, while he stood by the window with his back half turned, giving her what privacy he could in a room too small to offer very much of it. And by the time she reached the last letter, the most recent one, dated only weeks prior, stiff little note about the state of the roof at the Dower House, she understood entirely and completely the shape of the thing that had stood between them. The final annotation reads simply, "I have decided I will tell her when next I see her. I do not know if I will manage it, but I have decided." She looked up at him. "Tell me now," she said. He turned from the window. In the low lamplight of the study, his composed, careful face had cracked open into something rawer than she had ever seen him allow. And when he spoke, his voice was not economical at all, not dry, not distant, not the voice of a man who did not make jokes and rarely made declarations. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you. I think since the 2nd year of our marriage, when you sat in the drawing-room reading aloud from a novel neither of us particularly liked, and I found I did not want the evening to end. I did not know how to say it. My father taught me that feeling was a private, buried thing, something proven through duty and never through words, and I absorbed that lesson so thoroughly that by the time I understood I loved you, I had already spent years failing to tell you so. I wrote to you instead, because paper was safer than your face, and I told myself that was enough, that you would somehow know through my faithfulness in writing what I could not say aloud. I did not understand until tonight that faithfulness without honesty is simply another kind of silence." Evelina rose from the chair. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, though whether from grief or relief or something entirely new, she could not have said. "I let London believe you did not love me," she said, "because I believed it myself. I let Lady Southerton's cruelty settle into me like a fact rather than a rumor, because it was easier to accept the humiliation than to keep hoping and be disappointed again. I burned your letters because I could not bear to open one more and find nothing but weather and wheat and duty. I thought that was mercy. I thought I was protecting myself." "You were," he said, "as I was protecting myself in my own box of paper and ink. We have been two very careful people, Your Grace protecting ourselves from each other for 4 years, when what we needed all along was considerably less caution and considerably more honesty. I am done being careful," Evelina said. "So am I," said Julian. He crossed the room to her, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate care he had shown opening the drawer, as though he understood that this moment, too, deserved to be handled gently. He stopped before her, close enough that she could see, in the lamplight, every year of restrained feeling finally rising to the surface of his face. "I would ask your permission," he said, "before I do something I have wanted to do for a very long time and have never once had the courage to attempt." "Everyone else does whatever they please, Your Grace," Evelina said, and something of her old dry wit surfaced through the tears still wet on her cheeks. "But they don't usually ask permission first." "I am not everyone else," he said. "I am, apparently, a man who requires a rosewood box and a house full of gossiping servants to tell his own wife that he loves her. I imagine I can manage one more formality." "Then you have it," she said. "My permission." He kissed her, then, carefully, at first, as though he still feared some old cold rule might reassert itself and pull them apart. And then, when she did not pull away, when her hand rose instead to rest against his chest, with a depth of feeling that made 4 years of silence seem, suddenly, like a very small and very foolish thing to have survived. Ward travels quickly in a household of servants, and by the following morning there was not a soul below stairs at Marchwood House who did not know in some form or another that the Duke and Duchess had spent the previous evening locked in the study and had emerged well past midnight, looking entirely unlike the cold, distant pair. London had spent 4 years gossiping about Mrs. Pruitt, serving breakfast that morning, permitted herself the smallest, most private smile as she set down the teapot and said nothing at all, because there are some victories a woman simply chooses to enjoy in silence. Ward travels quickly among the aristocracy too, though rather less accurately. By the following week, Lady Southerton was heard remarking, with considerably less confidence than before, that she had perhaps been mistaken about the Marchwood marriage, and that the Duke had been seen at the opera with his hand resting, quite unnecessarily and quite constantly, at the small of his wife's back for the entirety of the performance. He had, in fact, been seen doing exactly that. It had not been unnecessary at all, as far as either of the Ashworths were concerned. They did not stop writing to each other. In the end, though the letters changed their character entirely, Julian still went to Derbyshire for the growing season because the estate required it, and duty had not stopped mattering simply because love had finally found its voice. But now Evelina read every letter the moment it arrived, sometimes twice, sometimes with her own quiet laughter at some dry observation he'd made about a fox or a hedgerow dispute, and she wrote back not the careful, guarded notes of a woman protecting herself from disappointment, but long, warm, unhurried pages that told him about her days, her thoughts, her small joys and complaints, the shape of her mind laid open at last, because she had finally understood there was someone on the other end who wanted, quite desperately, to read every word of it. He kept every one of those letters too. He did not need to annotate them any more. There was nothing left to search for between the lines, because she had stopped hiding anything there. A year later, when their first child was born, a daughter, with her mother's watchful gray eyes, and, as it would turn out, her father's habit of saying very little and meaning a very great deal by it, Julian brought the rosewood box up from the study and placed it, without a word, in the nursery, on a high shelf where it could be reached only by a grown hand and not a curious infant one. "Why there?" Evelina asked, watching him settle it into place. "Because someday," he said, "she will ask us how her parents fell in love, and I find I would rather show her the proof than try to explain it. Some things are easier read than told." Evelina thought of 4 years of unread letters turning to ash in a London grate, and of a box of guarded, guileless replies treasured in this very room, annotated in margins by a man too careful with his heart to spend it any way but quietly. "Some things," she agreed, "are indeed easier read than told." And outside the nursery window, the Marchwood fields turned gold with the last of the season's light, patient and unhurried, exactly the way love, it turned out, had always been between them, not absent, never absent, only waiting, faithfully, for someone brave enough to finally open the letter. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you even a little, I would love to know. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from tonight and which line in this story stayed with you longest. Stories like this one live and grow because of viewers like you. So if you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories when they arrive. Until then, from all of us here, good night and sweet dreams.